solutions to quiz 1 for Math 243. First one here, we're trying to estimate prevalence, steroid prevalence among current Major League Baseball players. So I randomly test 220 current players, 30% of these players test positive. Okay. What is my research objective? It's stated right in the first sentence here, or damn near. I want to estimate steroid prevalence among, maybe in parentheses I'll write all here, although you don't need to put that in, all current Major League Baseball players. The reason I put all here is to point out that my research objective really should have to do with my population, and we'll see later that our population is all current MLB baseball players, not just these 220 that we tested. What is the sample in my study? The sample are the players that you actually test. So not all the players, but just these 220. So the 220 MLB players that I tested. That subset of the population is the sample. What is the population? That's going to be all current MLB players. So important to differentiate between the sample and the population. Population is what we want to know about. The sample is what we actually know about. What are the descriptive statistics? So what descriptive statistics are a way of summarizing or analyzing the data. So for the data, you can kind of picture this huge list with 220 names on it, and it says yes, no. You know, well, I guess Barry Bonds isn't current, but Melky Cabrera, yeah, he tested positive. Like you can just, Alex Rodriguez probably would test positive. A bunch of different players that would test positive and a bunch that would not test positive. So you just have this list of names and yes or no, whether they tested positive or not. Hard to draw results from that. But this sentence right here where it says that 30% of these 220 players tested positive, that's a lot easier to draw a conclusion from. So what are the descriptive statistics? That would be that 30% of these tested players tested positive. Weird to have tested in there twice, but hopefully you can get what I'm getting at here. Descriptive statistics has to do with our sample, not our population. And from our sample, we can summarize what happened in our sample with kind of this sentence right here. State a reasonable conclusion. So I made this one a little bit different. I think in the homework they give you conclusions or up here and you have to identify it. Here I just ask you to state a reasonable conclusion. Be careful, make sure that your conclusion deals with your population, that it answers your research objective. So my research objective is I want to estimate steroid prevalence among all current MLB players. So a reasonable conclusion would be I estimate that 30%, how about that? I estimate that 30% of all, that's the key word in there, current MLB players are on steroids. So, I mean, this might seem easy, but there's a lot of subtleties in here that you have to be really careful about. Make sure that we're talking about our population down here, not our sample, and that we're answering our research objective. So that's kind of what I did in there. You also could have said, we conclude that less than half of current MLB players are on steroids or something like that. You can come to different conclusions as long as they're kind of answering this question up here and they're about our population. Determine whether data from each of the following variables is most likely quantitative. So quantitative, you're thinking numbers. Maybe I'll say think numbers with a mean and average, I think is the word we were using. That makes sense. Or qualitative, you're thinking qualities. Or categories, however you want to think about it. So we're just going to kind of go through one by one. Nationality, that doesn't really seem like it has anything to do with a number. It's more a category. So I would think that you would call this qualitative. Height, I think of that as more numerical. When I think of height, I'm imagining how many inches tall are each of these people. And sure, we could average them out. We could say the average person in this sample is 5'11" or whatever. So to me, this would be quantitative. I think if you could argue that it's qualitative, but you'd probably have to write a sentence about why. You'd have to say, well, I'm picturing height to be this data where it just says whether you're tall, medium, or short, or whatever. And then I guess they're categories. But I think the more natural answer would be quantitative here. Area code, that one's a little bit tricky. And when you might think it's quantitative because area codes are numbers, but it's not, it's qualitative. The reason it's qualitative is because area codes, it doesn't make sense to have the average of an area code. Area codes are more categories that people fit into. They're not the average of a bunch of area codes don't make sense. Number of cars somebody owns, I would say that is quantitative. It's numbers. You own them 3 cars. I own 2 cars. Someone else owns 1 car. In our sample, the average person owns 2.2 cars. Sure, that all makes sense. I think that would be quantitative. 40-yard dash time. That one's a little bit tricky too. I would call this one quantitative as well. I run a 4.9. You run a 4.7. Usain Bolt runs a 4.2. You know, the average person in our sample runs a 4.65, whatever. Those are numbers. The average makes sense. Again, if you thought about this data as 40-yard dash time, fast, slow, or normal, then I suppose you could think about them as categories, but I think you'd have to justify if you put that as your answer. I think quantitative is more natural. Attractiveness. That girl is a 9, that guy's an 8, whatever, on a scale of 1 to 10. Their numbers, average, sure, that makes sense. Got a really good looking sample. The average is 8.4. I mean, it's kind of a weird number, but it's a number and the average makes sense. I would say that is quantitative. This on a scale of 1 to 10 really emphasizes that it's quantitative. Last one here, blood pressure. Explain how it could be either one. All right, so I would say quantitative if data is a list of numbers. Like your blood pressure is 161, mine is 158. I don't know if those are high or normal or whatever, but if it's just a bunch of numbers, we could take the average. We could say the average blood pressure in our sample is 122 or whatever. But it could also be qualitative if our data were more categorical. If the data were classifications like, I don't know, high blood pressure, normal blood pressure, low blood pressure, that kind of stuff. So if we put people into categories, if that's what our data actually says, then it's qualitative. But if we just list the numbers themselves, your blood pressure is this number, mine is this number, then it'd be quantitative. So kind of hard. The point in this last one is it's kind of hard to answer all of these questions because we don't really know what the data looks like. They're kind of describing the data here, but maybe you can picture the data appearing a little bit different. But hopefully that makes sense. Now you're pretty good on the difference between quantitative and qualitative because we'll need to use that in the next section. But that's the end of this quiz.